My daughter looked me dead in the eyes at my own kitchen table and said, "Dad, you're being dramatic. It's just a signature." 3 days later, I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot with a cracked rib and a split lip, texting my attorney 4 words, "Phase 1 is done." I want to be clear about something before I tell you how this all unfolded. I am not a victim. I am 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government, the last 11 of those as a senior investigator for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I've sat across from congressmen, CEOs, and cartel money launderers and watched their faces when they realized the net had already closed. I know what desperation looks like. I know what greed smells like. And I know, better than most people alive, that the most dangerous criminals are not strangers. They are the ones who know your garage code and still have a key to the back door. My daughter's name is Vivian. She is 41 years old. She has her mother's eyes and, as I have come to understand, absolutely none of her mother's character. Her husband is a man named Preston, and if you looked up the word opportunist in the dictionary, you would find a photograph of Preston in a golf shirt he can't afford, standing next to a leased BMW he is 3 payments behind on. My wife Carol passed away 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend much time on that because this is not a story about grief. It's a story about what grief can expose in the people around you. When Carol died, I watched who came to the funeral to mourn and who came to the funeral to take inventory. Preston came to take inventory. I noticed it at the reception afterward, right here in this house. He walked through the hallway with a slow, casual gait, the kind a man uses when he's pretending to look at family photos but is really counting square footage. He tapped the crown molding in the dining room with one knuckle the same way a buyer does at an open house. I filed that away and said nothing. That was 22 months ago. For the next year and a half, the visits from Vivian and Preston went from occasional to monthly to, by last spring, almost weekly. Each visit came with a new layer of concern. "Dad, you look tired. Dad, this lawn is getting out of hand. Dad, a man your age shouldn't be managing all of this alone." The concern would have been touching if it hadn't always ended the same way, with some version of, "Have you thought any more about your plans for the house?" I had thought about it. I had thought about very little else. I'm going to tell you what they didn't know. Carol and I had talked about this, not about dying, but about what comes after. She had watched her own mother's assets get picked apart by extended family after her grandmother passed, and she made me promise, "Whatever you build," she said to me about 6 months before she got sick, "protect it. Not from taxes, from people." I promised her. And a retired federal investigator does not make promises he doesn't intend to keep. 8 months before that kitchen table conversation, I had already restructured everything. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement assets, everything went into an irrevocable trust. My attorney, a sharp woman named Agnes, who has been practicing estate law in this city for 30 years, handled it all. As far as Vivian and Preston knew, they were looking at a widowed 67-year-old man rattling around in a 4-bedroom house with a modest pension and some savings in a checking account. What they were actually looking at was a ghost. The real assets were already gone, already protected, already somewhere they would never reach. I also, in those same 8 months, made a few other quiet preparations. I had a contractor I trusted install 4 small cameras in the common areas of the house: the kitchen, the living room, the front hallway, and my home office. Not hidden exactly, but not obvious. I did not tell Vivian. The phone call that set everything in motion came on a Thursday morning in April. I was on the back porch with my coffee when she called. "Dad." Her voice had that particular brightness that I had learned to distrust. "We want to take you to dinner this weekend. Just the 3 of us. Is Saturday good?" I asked who the third person was. There was a half-second pause. Preston's mother, Sylvia, she's been wanting to meet you properly for years. She's in town. I had met Sylvia twice. Both times she had sized me up with the thoroughness of an appraiser and the warmth of a parking meter. But I said Saturday sounded fine. I said I was looking forward to it. I called Agnes before noon. Saturday dinner was at a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where the booths are leather and the prices are not on the menu. Preston insisted on it, which told me everything, because Preston had not voluntarily paid for a dinner in the 12 years I had known him. When a man like Preston reaches for the check, he is not being generous. He is making an investment. Sylvia was already at the table when I arrived. She was in her late 60s, well-dressed in the way that costs money and shows it, with a kind of composure that comes from decades of calculating exactly what she can get away with saying in polite company. She stood when I came in. She put her hands on my arms. "Oh, you poor dear," she said. "Vivian talks about how hard it's been for you." We had not exchanged 10 words before she had already cast me as the tragic figure in a story she was writing. The dinner itself was pleasant on the surface. Sylvia was a capable conversationalist. She asked about my career with the right amount of flattery, said she could see I was sharp as a tack, laughed at the right moments. Preston was unusually quiet. Vivian picked at her food. I noticed she barely drank. People who are about to ask for something important don't drink. They need their wits. Dessert arrived. Sylvia set down her fork. "Walter," she began, and I stopped her. "No one calls me Walter," I said pleasantly. "It's just Hank. My middle name, the name I have gone by my entire adult life." She blinked and recalibrated. "Hank," she said, "I hope you'll forgive me for being direct. At our age, I find that dancing around things is a waste of good time." She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. I'd had some health setbacks recently. Nothing life-threatening, but at my stage of life, I think it's wise to start simplifying. I've been renting an apartment in Scottsdale, but the truth is, the maintenance of independent living is becoming a burden. She paused. "Vivian and Preston have been so generous. They've offered to let me stay with them, but their place, as you know, is small, and they mentioned, well." She looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at her plate. "They mentioned that you have more room than you need." I let the silence sit for a moment. "You're asking if you can move into my house," I said. "Temporarily," Preston said, speaking for the first time in 20 minutes, "just until we can sort out a longer-term solution for Mom. 6 months, maybe." I looked at Vivian. She finally looked up, and in her eyes I saw something that carved out a small, hollow place in my chest. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even uncomfortable. She was watching me the way a person watches a door. They're waiting to open. "Let me think about it," I said. Preston nodded. Sylvia smiled. Vivian went back to her food. I had no intention of letting Sylvia move in. What I did intend was to give them enough time to show me who they really were. The following weekend, Vivian came by the house alone. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. She asked if I had thought about Sylvia's situation. I said I was still considering it. Then she said it. "Dad, you're being dramatic. It's just a signature." I looked at her. "I haven't mentioned anything about signing anything." She held my gaze for just a second too long. "I just mean, whatever you decide, it doesn't have to be complicated." "What would I be signing, Vivian?" She looked away first. "Preston thought it might be easier if, since Sylvia is going to be here, she's added to the deed. Just for insurance purposes, so she can make medical decisions if something happens to one of you. You know how it is with older people living together." There was, added to the deed, 3 words that would have handed a stranger co-ownership of the home Carol and I had built over 35 years together. I had heard variations of this exact language in 11 years of federal financial crime investigation. It's not deft when it's framed as paperwork. "I'll think about it," I said. She left. I went to my office and called Agnes. What I found out in the next week, through Agnes and the private investigator I had retained 4 months prior, painted a very specific picture. Preston's LLC, a property management company he had started 3 years ago, was hemorrhaging money. He was behind on the business loan, behind on his personal credit cards, and had recently been sued by a former business partner for breach of contract. More importantly, Sylvia was not just a woman with health concerns. She was a woman with a history of being added to deeds. She had done this twice before in Arizona. With aging neighbors she had befriended, both had eventually signed over partial ownership of their homes. One of those cases was still in probate court. I was not dealing with a lonely mother-in-law. I was dealing with a professional. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I documented everything. I gave the appearance of wavering, of a man slowly being worn down by family pressure. I called Vivian twice with vague, semi-encouraging responses. I mentioned to Preston casually that I had been feeling more tired lately. I bought groceries I didn't need and let them accumulate on the counter, so that when Vivian stopped by unannounced, the house looked slightly less organized than usual. I played the role of a man slowly losing his grip. I also set a date, Mother's Day Sunday. Vivian had already suggested it as a good time for a family dinner. I agreed. I also upgraded the recording software on all 4 cameras. I also made sure my attorney knew the exact timeline. I also invited my neighbor Butch, a retired county sheriff's deputy who has been my closest friend for 20 years, to be present in the house that day in the guest bedroom with the door closed and his phone charged. Mother's Day arrived clear and warm. They came at noon, all 3 of them. Vivian carrying a casserole dish, Preston in a blazer, which he almost never wears, Sylvia with a small wrapped gift, a candle, the kind of gestures that cost $12 and create the impression of warmth. I opened the door wide, smiled, told them how glad I was they were here. The early part of the afternoon was careful, polite. Sylvia complimented the kitchen, said the neighborhood reminded her of somewhere she'd lived before. Preston toured the backyard and said the space had a lot of potential. I said I had always thought so too. We ate. Vivian's casserole was good. I said so. We talked about nothing that mattered. I watched them do the work of not rushing, of being patient, of waiting for the right moment. They were good at this. They had clearly done it before. After lunch, Sylvia excused herself to use the restroom. She was gone for 11 minutes. My home office is at the end of the hall. I noted the time. When she came back, Preston set his coffee cup down and looked at me with the expression of a man bracing to lift something heavy. "Hank," he said, "we've been patient. I know this is your home, your decision, but we're at a point where we need to make some arrangements for Mom, and honestly, for you too." "What kind of arrangements?" I asked. "We think it would be best," Vivian said, and her voice was steady in a way that told me she had rehearsed this. "If you let us help manage things here, the finances, the upkeep. You've been handling everything alone since Mom died. That's not fair to you. And Sylvia moving in," Preston continued, "would help offset some of the cost. She'd contribute to utilities, to groceries, and we thought if we formalized the arrangement," he slid a document across the table toward me, "it would protect everyone." I looked at the document without picking it up. It was a co-ownership agreement, 2 pages, drafted by someone who was not a licensed attorney in this state. Sylvia's name was already on it. So was mine, on a signature line at the bottom. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Vivian. "Sweetheart," I said, "your mother's ashes are in the office at the end of that hall, in a cedar box on the 2nd shelf. I put fresh flowers next to it every week." I paused. Sylvia spent 11 minutes alone in that hallway. I want you to understand what I'm about to say very carefully. I pushed the document back across the table. No. Preston's face shifted. The patient, measured expression cracked. Hank, we're trying to help you. You're trying to help yourself, I said. I know about the breach of contract lawsuit. I know about the LLC debt. I know about Sylvia's history in Arizona. I watched the color drain from Preston's face. I've known for 4 months. Vivian stood up from the table. Dad, you had someone investigating us? I did, I said, and I have been investigating people who defraud elderly Americans for 32 years. I am not a confused old man. I am the person who put confused old men in front of grand juries. What happened next was not planned. Or rather, I planned for the possibility of it, but I hoped it would not come to it. Preston reached across the table and grabbed my wrist, not violently but firmly, with a grip that was meant to communicate something. He looked at me and said, "Sign the paper, Hank. We're not leaving without it." That was the moment Butch opened the guest bedroom door and walked into the hallway. He is a large man, Butch, 6'2", 230 pounds, with a calm that comes from decades of knowing exactly what he can legally do in any given situation. He walked to the kitchen doorway, leaned against the frame, and looked at Preston. "Let go of his arm," Butch said. Preston let go. What he did next, though, was not let it rest. He shoved back from the table and stood up, and the chair went sideways, and when he reached for the document on the table, I reached for it at the same moment, and in the chaos of that moment, his elbow came around hard and caught me directly in the left side of my rib cage. Whether it was deliberate or panicked, it did not matter. The result was a crack that I felt before I heard it. I sat back down. I did not make a sound. I have been in rooms with dangerous people many times in my career. I have learned that the most powerful thing you can do when something has just gone in your favor is to be very, very still. "We're leaving," Vivian said. Her voice was different now, thin. She knew. "You're not taking that document," I said quietly. "They left without it?" Butch called 911 from my kitchen while I sat at the table and breathed carefully. The responding officer, a young woman who was thorough and professional, took my statement. She looked at the document on the table, looked at Butch, looked at the bruise already forming on my side, and called for a second unit. I was taken by ambulance to the hospital. 2 cracked ribs. Nothing punctured. I was told by a resident who looked about 26 that I was lucky. I told him luck had very little to do with it. From my hospital bed, I texted Agnes. 4 words. "Phase 1 is done." She responded in under a minute. "I'll file in the morning." I powered off my personal phone, the one Vivian had the number for, and did not turn it back on for 4 days. What I was told happened at the house over the next 48 hours came to me later through Butch and through the police report. Vivian called the house 7 times. Preston drove by twice, slow, the way people do when they're deciding something. Sylvia, according to her phone records, placed 3 calls to the attorney who had drafted the co-ownership document. That attorney, when contacted by Agnes, declined to comment and subsequently withdrew from his bar association in a manner that is still, as far as I understand it, under review. 4 days later, sitting in my living room with my ribs taped and a cup of decaf I didn't particularly want, I powered my personal phone back on. 41 missed calls, 38 from Vivian, 3 from Preston. I did not call back. I sent a single text to Vivian's number. It said, "I have retained counsel. Please direct all further communication to Agnes Whitmore's office. Her number is below." The silence after that was its own kind of statement. What Agnes filed was meticulous, a civil complaint for attempted deed fraud, citing the forged document which turned out to be fraudulent on its face since the notary signature on it belonged to a notary in Phoenix who had been deceased for 14 months. An assault complaint for the cracked ribs, supported by the hospital report, Butch's sworn witness statement, and, most importantly, 47 seconds of clear footage from the kitchen camera, and a separate report forwarded to the Arizona Attorney General's office regarding Sylvia's history, which Agnes had already flagged in coordination with an attorney representing one of the families from those prior cases. I did not go to trial. Neither did they, in the traditional sense. What happened was something that felt, from the outside, like a negotiation, but was in fact a controlled demolition. Preston's LLC filed for bankruptcy 6 weeks after Mother's Day. The breach of contract lawsuit resulted in a default judgment against him personally for just under $90,000. His credit, which was already poor, became functionally unusable. Sylvia retained a criminal defense attorney in Phoenix and cooperated with investigators in Arizona in exchange for a reduced charge, which still resulted in 2 years of supervised probation and permanent prohibition from serving as a cosigner or trustee on any real estate transaction in the state of Arizona. The deed fraud complaint here was settled civilly. Preston and Vivian paid Agnes's fees in full as a condition of the settlement, which I will admit gave me a small and specific satisfaction I am not ashamed of. Vivian called once more, 6 weeks after the settlement closed. I answered. She did not apologize. She explained. There is a difference, and it matters. She told me about the debt, about the pressure from Preston, about how she had convinced herself that it was not really hurting me because I had so much, and she had so little, which is the story people tell themselves when they are doing something they know is wrong. I listened. I did not fill the silences. When she was done, I said, I hope you find a way to build something that's actually yours and amend it. Then I said goodbye. I have not heard from her since. The house is still mine. The trust is still intact. Carol's ashes are still on the second shelf in the office, and the flowers I put there last Tuesday were yellow tulips because those were her favorite in spring. The quiet here is different now than it was right after she died. In those first months, the quiet had weight to it, a physical pressure in the rooms. Now it is just quiet. The ordinary quiet of a house that belongs to the person living in it. I sit on the board of a senior protection nonprofit now, 3 mornings a week. We work with elderly homeowners who are being targeted by deed fraud schemes, and there are more of them than most people understand. The tactics are almost always the same. The framing as concern, the language of help, the slow, patient construction of a narrative in which the target is frail and the family is burdened, and the only reasonable solution is a signature. What I tell the people who call us, the ones who are scared, the ones who are not sure if they are overreacting, the ones who say, but, this is my daughter, but this is my son. What I tell them is this: love does not come with paperwork. If someone who loves you is asking you to sign something, they can wait for your attorney to review it. Anyone who cannot wait for your attorney to review it is not there for you. I am 67 years old. I have outlasted a federal career, a cancer diagnosis that took my wife, and a scheme designed by the people I loved most to take everything Carol and I built together. I am not frail. I am not confused. I am not finished. What they mistook for an old man going quietly was actually 32 years of knowing exactly when to be still and exactly when to move. The hardest part of all of it wasn't the cracked ribs. It was sitting at that kitchen table, looking at my daughter's face and understanding, clearly and finally, that she had made her choice long before she walked through my door that Sunday. People talk about betrayal like it arrives as a surprise. In my experience, it rarely does. It arrives as a confirmation. You feel it building for months, the way weather changes before a storm, subtle shifts in pressure that your body registers before your mind is willing to name them. I felt it in the way Vivian stopped asking how I was doing and started asking how the house was holding up. I felt it in the way Preston's eyes moved when he walked through a room. By the time that forged document landed on my kitchen table, I wasn't shocked. I was just finished waiting. What I keep thinking about, sitting out here in the yard on these quiet mornings, is the question of how something like this is even possible. Not legally, not practically, but humanly. How does a person look at their father and decide he is a resource to be managed, rather than a man to be loved? I don't think the answer is that Vivian was born without a conscience. I think the answer is simpler and sadder than that. She stopped practicing the harder parts of being a decent person, and when you stop practicing something, you lose the ability to do it. Honesty is like that. So is courage. So is the basic willingness to sit with discomfort rather than reaching for a shortcut. Preston was the easier one to understand. He was drowning, and he reached for the nearest thing he could grab. That is not admirable, but it is at least legible. Sylvia had turned this into a system, a practice pattern refined over years, which is its own kind of discipline, though applied entirely in the wrong direction. What I know from 32 years in federal investigation is that people who are very skilled at deception are not born that way. They built that skill deliberately, one small compromise at a time, until the compromises stop feeling like compromises at all. What stopped them was not cleverness on my part. I want to be clear about that. What stopped them was preparation, patience, and an absolute refusal to pretend I was something I was not. I did not play the frail old man because I am not one. I played a man who knew what was coming and had the discipline to wait for the right moment. That discipline came from Carol, honestly, more than from any career. She was the one who taught me that quiet is not the same as passive, and that the most powerful response to being underestimated is simply to be ready. There is a cause and effect to all of this that I think people sometimes miss in stories like mine. Preston's LLC didn't collapse because I outmaneuvered him. It collapsed because it was built on debt and dishonesty, which is a foundation that fails on its own timeline, regardless of what any one person does. Sylvia's probation in Arizona was not a punishment handed down by fate. It was the logical conclusion of a pattern she had chosen to build and maintain. What I did was simply ensure that when those things fell, they fell cleanly, without taking me down with them. I am 67 years old. I have more mornings behind me than ahead of me, and I have made my peace with that. What I have not made peace with, and never will, is the idea that age is a vulnerability, that gray hair is an invitation, that a man who has earned his quiet has somehow forfeited his right to keep it. If you are watching this and you feel that pressure, that slow, patient erosion from people who call it love while they inventory your assets, I want you to hear this from someone who has been exactly where you are. You are not being paranoid. You are not being dramatic. Trust what you are feeling. Get the right people in your corner and do not sign a single thing until someone you chose, not someone they chose, has read every word. The house is still mine. The trust is intact. And every Tuesday, there are fresh flowers next to Carol's cedar box on that shelf. That is not luck. That is what happens when you refuse to disappear quietly.